Hey everybody, Marcus here. This video will be the first in a series discussing, feminist epistemology. Now, originally I had intended to close off my series on feminism with a single video relating to feminist epistemology. Well, that, however, was not possible as the topic is far too involved to sufficiently cover in one video. As such, this series on feminist epistemology should be considered the continuation and closure of my series about feminism. If you have not watched my 3 videos on feminism, then you should do so now, as feminist epistemology is circling back to what we had described in the first video, namely, women's way of knowing. Now, in that first video, we looked at the distinction that feminists have made between vertical thinking and lateral thinking. Vertical thinking was described as a cognitive style attributed to men. Vertical thinking is an adversarial cognitive style that always looks to find fault or error in what is being presented. Vertical thinking deals in absolutes, like a Sith. It is the game of impersonal reason. Vertical thinkers are tough-minded, like doormen at exclusive clubs. They do not let anything in unless they are certain it is good. Presented with a proposition, vertical thinkers will look for a loophole, a factual error, a logical contradiction, or the omission of contradictory evidence. Vertical thinkers play the doubting game. But most importantly, vertical thinking is what created the patriarchy and all the evils that, supposedly follow. Lateral thinking, on the other hand, is more spiritual, relational, and inclusive. Peggy McIntosh, who had developed this vertical and lateral thesis, thinks that women and minorities tend to be lateral thinkers. The aim of lateral thinking is not to win, but to be in a deeper relationship with, the invisible elements of the universe. So McIntosh's project was to change the curriculum in schools in order to move students away from vertical thinking and towards lateral thinking, towards a listen and believe style of thinking. Okay. After 30-some-odd years of developing the thesis of lateral thinking, feminism has sprouted its own epistemological account. Now, the feminist epistemologists' claim is that dominant knowledge practices disadvantage women in 6 ways, and these ways are as follows. By excluding women from inquiry. 2. Denying women epistemic authority. 3. Denigrating women's feminine cognitive styles and modes of knowledge. 4. Producing theories of women that represent women as inferior, deviant, or significant only in the ways they serve male interests. 5. Producing theories of social phenomena that render women's activities and interests, or gendered power relations, invisible. And 6. Producing knowledge, such as science and technology, that is not useful for people in subordinate positions, or that reinforces gender and other social hierarchies. So, feminist epistemologists trace these failures to flawed conceptions of knowledge, knowers, objectivity, and the scientific method. They offer diverse accounts of how to overcome these failures. They aim mostly to do the following. 1. Explain why the entry of women and feminist scholars into different academic disciplines, especially in biology and the social sciences, has generated new questions, theories, and methods. 2. Show how gender and feminist values and perspectives have played a causal role in these transformations. 3. Promote theories that aid egalitarian and liberation movements. And 4. Defend these developments as cognitive, not just social advances. Okay, as a summation, what has been covered are the stated problems espoused by feminist epistemology and an account of some high-level objectives that feminists have set in order to resolve these perceived issues. Now, did you notice anything particularly unusual about the problems and goals that were stated? Does anything appear to be missing from these epistemological pursuits? Well, how about this? The problem of knowledge itself. Now, let me explain. If you have not yet seen my video entitled Epistemology, Foundationalism, and Coherentism, I recommend you pause this video and watch that, to get a clearer picture of what I'm about to say. Now, in that video, I described 2 epistemological systems that attempt to account for what constitutes and justifies a belief as knowledge. We started with the definition of knowledge as presented in the Platonic dialogues, and the definition Plato gives is that knowledge is justified true belief. From there, we explored how we can attain such justification. So far, we have not witnessed any stated goal in feminist epistemology to account for what knowledge is. How can we come to be justified in holding knowledge, or, for that matter, we have not seen a single hint that feminist epistemology is even going to bother to try to account for these things. In fact, feminist epistemology does not attempt to answer any of these things. Feminist epistemology does not attempt to give an account of what belief counts as knowledge, and it does not try to even define knowledge at all. So if it does not do this, then what exactly is its relationship to epistemic systems like foundationalism or coherentism? Well, from what I've come to understand of feminist epistemology, we need to look at it as attempting to give an account of a filter that overlays more traditional theories of knowledge. So, in this way, it is not in giving a competing account of knowledge itself as much as it is accounting for filters to knowledge. Now, this may be a little confusing, so let me try to elaborate. When I was watching a lecture series on the subject of human psychology from the University of Yale, the professor played a certain video to the class. Before the video was played, the professor asked the class to count how many times a white bowling pin was tossed between two jugglers. The video was played, and what we saw was two men standing on either side of the scene juggling a total of 2 bowling pins. One pin was black and the other white. The video, it went on for about 30 seconds. The juggling was quite fast, but not so fast that you could not count the white pin crossing the center of the screen. After the 30-second video was over, I counted 22 times that the white pin had crossed the center of the screen. Now, after the video ended, the professor asked the class how many times they saw the pin cross. Everyone said 22 times. Then, the professor asked, what was the color of the dancing gorilla? Now, everyone looked confused. The video was then played again with the instructions to look for the dancing gorilla. After 10 seconds into the scene, you could clearly see a man in a gorilla costume come out from the left side of the screen and dance across the screen behind the jugglers. The gorilla danced the same trajectory as the bowling pins were being tossed. Now, the gorilla was clearly visible and blatantly obvious, but no one saw the gorilla when they were focused on counting the white bowling pin. You see, feminist epistemology attempts to give an account of who can see what. It tries to account on why some people don't see a gorilla where others do. Now, let me give you another example to clarify this concept of an overlay, a filter, lens, glasses, or whatever else you want to call it. Now, imagine that you ride an overground tram to get around the city you live in. Let us imagine this tram has a total of 10 stops. Now, imagine if I were to ask you, how many of those stops have a handicap ramp? The odds are very good you would not be able to answer that question very accurately. You would most likely try to visualize the layout of each stop and then, do some sort of mental count on the spot. Now, let us imagine you would ask the same question to a man in a wheelchair who also uses that tram to get around the city. The man in the wheelchair would most likely know off the top of his head. Now, clearly both you and the man in the wheelchair can both physically see the handicap ramps as you pass them by, but only the handicapped man pays any attention to them. The man in the wheelchair has a different lens he is experiencing the world than you do, even though you both technically see the same things and interact with the same environment. The objective of feminist epistemology appears to be to account for these different lenses, to account for what a person sees because they are paying attention to it and how that plays itself out in the world. Feminist epistemology does not appear to concern itself in how you or the man in the wheelchair are justified in knowing there are X amount of ramps, but in that the man in the wheelchair sees the ramps where you do not. Okay. If we take everything we have said so far and try to generalize it, we end up with the core of feminist epistemology, the concept of the situated knower. Feminist epistemology conceives of knowers as situated in particular relations to what is known and to other knowers. What is known and the way that it is known thereby reflects the situation or perspective of the knower. Here we are concerned with claims to know, not the question of which claims are true or warranted. In essence, the knower is a person who has a perspective situated in various contexts. The contexts that feminist epistemology outlines are as follows. Embodiment. People experience the world by using their bodies, which have different constitutions and are differently located in space and time. In virtue of their different physical locations, observers who stand in front of an object have different information about it than observers who have a distant or bird's eye view of the object. First person versus third person knowledge. People have first person access to some of their own bodily and mental states, yielding direct knowledge of phenomenological facts about what it is like for them to be in these states. Third parties may know these states only by interpreting external symptoms, imaginative projection, or obtaining their testimony. Emotions, attitudes, interests, and values. People often represent objects in relation to their emotions, attitudes, and interests. A thief represents a lock as a frustrating obstacle, while its owner represents the lock as a comforting source of security. Personal knowledge of others. People have different knowledge of others in virtue of their different personal relationships to them. Such knowledge is often tacit, incompletely articulated, and intuitive. Like the knowledge it takes, to get a joke. It is more an interpretive skill in making sense of a person than a set of propositions. Because people behave differently towards others, and others interpret their behaviors differently, depending on their personal relationships, what others know of them depends on these relationships. Know-how. People have different skills, which may also be a source of different propositional knowledge. An expert dog handler knows how to elicit more interesting behavior from a dog than a novice does. Such know-how expresses a more sophisticated understanding of dogs on the part of the expert and also generates new phenomena about dogs for investigation. Cognitive styles. People have different styles of investigation and representation. What looks like one phenomenon to a lumper may look like three to a splitter. Background beliefs and worldviews. People form different beliefs about an object in virtue of different background beliefs. In virtue of the different background beliefs against which they interpret a patient's symptoms, a patient may think he is having a heart attack while his doctor believes he just has heartburn. Differences in global metaphysical or political worldviews, such as naturalism, theism, liberalism, or Marxism, may also generate different beliefs about particulars on a more comprehensive scale. Relations to other inquirers. People may stand in different epistemic relations to other inquirers. For example, as informants, interlocutors, students, which affect their access to relevant information and their ability to convey their beliefs to others. Now, these kinds of situatedness affect knowledge in several ways. They influence knowers' access to information and the terms in which they represent what they know. They bear on the form of their knowledge. They affect their attitudes towards their beliefs, their standards of justification, and the authority with which they lay claim to their beliefs and can offer them to others. Finally, they affect knowers' assessment of which claims are significant or important. Now, feminists are particularly interested in a situatedness not yet covered, namely social situation. Feminist epistemology focuses on how the social location of the knower affects what and how the person knows. It is thus a branch of social epistemology. An individual's social locations consists of his ascribed social identities, such as gender, race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, caste, kinship status, and social roles and relationships such as occupation, political party membership, and so on. Now, this social situatedness previously mentioned gender. If we drill down on gender, we have the feminist epistemologists tracking gender situatedness on the following criteria. Gender roles. Men and women are assigned to distinct social roles. For example, most societies reserve political and military offices mostly for men, and assign women mostly child-rearing responsibilities. Gender norms. Men and women are expected to comply with different norms of behaviors and bodily comportments. For example, men are expected to be assertive and athletic, women deferential and modest. Gender norms are tailored to gender roles. Men and women are expected to conform to those norms and make them fit to their gender roles, whether or not they actually occupy these roles. Gender traits and virtues. Psychological traits are considered masculine and feminine if they dispose their bearers to comply with the gender norms assigned to men and women, respectively. Masculine traits are therefore regarded as virtues in men and often vices in women, while feminine traits are regarded as vices in men and virtues in women. Gendered performance or behavior. Many feminist theorists, often influenced by postmodernism, stress the contextual and performative aspect of gender. Rather than viewing masculine and femininity as fixed traits, these theorists represent human beings as more flexible and disposed to enact both masculine and feminine behaviors in different contexts. The man who avoids tenderly comforting a crying baby in the presence of women may do so when alone, for example. Masculinity and femininity can be seen as contrasting styles of performance in almost any role. Female bodybuilders strive to show off their muscles in a feminine way, for example. Gender identity. A person's ascribed gender identity, how others identify him or her, may not match his or her subjective gender identity. Subjective gender identity includes all of the ways one might understand oneself to be a man, a woman, both, or neither. One could identify with any subset of gender norms, roles, and traits ascribed to the gender of which one sees oneself as a member while repudiating others. One could even repudiate them all, but still identify oneself as a man or a woman in terms of what one sees as distinct roles men and women ought to play in bringing about a future. One could, as many feminists do, understand one's gender identity as a predicament shared by all with the same ascribed identity, and thus as a basis for collective action to change the very basis of one's gender identity. One could embrace an androgynous identity, decline to view oneself in gendered polarized terms at all, or play with gender identities in a postmodernist spirit. Gender symbolism. Animals and inanimate objects may be placed in a gendered field of representation through conventional association, imaginative projection, and metaphorical thinking. Thus, the garage is regarded as a male space, the kitchen female. Male deer are said to have harems, pears are seen as womanly, assault rifles as manly. By breaking up the situatedness of gender in this way, the feminist epistemologist concludes that there are forms of gendered knowledge. The following is what feminist epistemologists consider gendered knowledge. The phenomenology of gendered bodies. People's bodies are both differently sexed and differently gendered. Early child socialization trains boys' and girls' bodies to different norms of bodily comportment. In the U.S., these norms stress physical freedom, aggressive play, large motor skills, informal and relaxed posture, and indifference to clothing and neatness in boys. Physical constraint, subdued play, small motor skills, formal and modest posture, and self-consciousness about clothing and neatness for girls. Once internalized, such norms profoundly affect the phenomenology of embodiment. They inform men's and women's distinct first-person knowledge of what it is like to inhabit a body, to express capacities unique to one sex or another, and to have experiences that are manifested through different body parts in differently sexed bodies. They also cause men's and women's experiences of gendered behaviors that both can perform to differ in comfort, fluidity, feelings of naturalness or novelty, self-consciousness, confidence, awkwardness, shame, and so forth. One question these facts raise for feminist epistemology is to what extent dominant models of the world, especially of the relation between minds and bodies, have seemed compelling because they conform to a male or masculine phenomenology. Gendered first-person knowledge to say. It is one thing to know what sexual harassment is and how to identify it in a case described in third-person terms. It is another to come to the recognition, I have been sexually harassed. Many women who are able to see that women in general are disadvantaged have difficulty recognizing themselves as sharing women's predicament. The problems of dissay knowledge are particularly pressing for feminist theory because it is committed to theorizing in ways that women can use to improve their lives. This entails that women be able to recognize themselves and their lives in feminist accounts of women's predicament. Feminist epistemology is therefore particularly concerned with investigating the conditions of feminist self-understanding and the social settings in which it may arise. Feminist consciousness-raising sessions, women's studies classes, and so forth. Gendered emotions, attitudes, interests, and values. Feminist theory defines a representation as androcentric if it depicts the world in relation to male or masculine interests, emotions, attitudes, or values. A male interest is an interest a man has in virtue of the goals given to him by social roles designated as especially appropriate for men to occupy, or in virtue of his subjective gender identity. A masculine interest is an interest a man has in virtue of the attitudes that are thought specifically appropriate to men. Such attitudes and interests structure the cognition of those who have them. For example, a representational scheme that classifies women as either babes, dogs, whores, or mothers reflects the androcentric attitudes, interests, and values of single heterosexual adolescent men who view women in terms of their fantasized eligibility for sexual intercourse with them. A representation is gynocentric if it depicts the world in relation to female or feminine interests, emotions, attitudes, or values. When a man is described as an eligible bachelor, this reflects the gynocentric perspective of a heterosexual single woman interested in marriage. An interest, emotion, attitude, or value might be symbolically gendered even if men and women do not manifest it differently. For example, the ethics of care represents moral problems in terms of symbolically feminine values, values culturally associated with women's gender roles. It thus can qualify as a symbolically gynocentric perspective, even if men and women do not differ in their propensity to represent moral problems in these terms and to act accordingly. Feminist epistemology raises numerous questions about these phenomena. Can situated emotion responses to things be a valid source of knowledge about them? Do dominant practices and conceptions of science and scientific method reflect an androcentric perspective, or a perspective that reflects other dominant positions, as of race and colonial rule? Do mainstream philosophical conceptions of objectivity, knowledge, and reason reflect an androcentric perspective? How would the conceptual framework of particular sciences change if they reflected the interests of females? Knowledge of others in gendered relations. Gender norms differentially structure the social spaces to which men and women are admitted, as well as the representations of self to others. Men manifest their male identity and females their female identity differently alone than in mixed company, and differently in these settings than in gendered segregated contexts. Male and female inquirers therefore have access to different information about others. Male and female ethnographers may be admitted to different social spaces. Even when admitted to the same social spaces, their presence has different effects on those being observed. Research that elicits information about others through personal contact between the researchers and the research subjects therefore raises the question of how findings might be influenced by the gendered relations between researchers and subjects, and whether gender-inclusive research teams are in a better position to detect this. Ethnography, which derives propositional knowledge of others from personal knowledge of native informants in long-term, often intimate relationships, raises these issues most acutely. Gendered skills. Some skills are labeled masculine or feminine because men and women need them specifically to perform their respective gender roles, and they are not generally useful for almost any role. It takes a particular knowledge of small children to know how to comfort them, a particular knowledge of soldiers to know how to whip up their morale. Although men and women alike may acquire these skills, they are considered the peculiar responsibility of one or the other gender. Men and women may therefore have differential access to such skill-based knowledge. To the extent that the skill is perceived by the agent as the proper province of the other gender, he or she may have a difficult time seeing himself or herself perform it confidently and fluidly. This inability to self-identify with the task can impair performance. The feedback effect of the phenomenology of gendered embodiment and de knowledge of one's subjective gender identity can therefore influence the exercise of gendered skills. To the extent that a skill is perceived by others as the proper province of one gender, others may grant or withhold acknowledgement of an agent's expertise. If the successful exercise of the skill requires that others be willing to accept it as competent performance, others' gender-based readiness or refusal to grant expertise to an agent in exercising that skill can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. These phenomena raise various questions for epistemology. Does the masculine symbolism of certain scientific skills, such as of assuming an objective stance towards nature, interfere with the integration of women into science? Do actually or symbolically feminine skills aid the acquisition of scientific knowledge? Gender cognitive styles. Some theorists believe that men and women have different cognitive styles. Whether or not this is true, cognitive styles are gendered symbolized. Deductive, analytic, atomistic, acontextual, and quantitative cognitive styles are labeled masculine, while intuitive, synthetic, holistic, contextual, and qualitative cognitive styles are labeled feminine. For example, it is seen as masculine to make one's point by means of argument, feminine to make one's point by means of narrative. Argument is commonly cast as an adversarial mode of discourse, in which one side claims vindication by vanquishing the opposition. Such pursuit of dominance follows the competitive patterns of male gendered roles in combat, athletics, and business. Narrative is a seductive mode of discourse, persuading by an enticing invitation to take up the perspective of the narrator, which excites one's imagination and feelings. Its operations are more like love than war, and thereby follows a mode of persuasion, though more suitable for women. These phenomena raise numerous epistemological questions. Does the quest for masculine prestige, by using masculine methods, distort practices of knowledge acquisition? Are some kinds of sound research unfairly ignored because of their association with feminine cognitive styles? Do feminine cognitive styles yield knowledge that is inaccessible or harder to achieve by masculine means? Gendered background beliefs and worldviews. We have seen above how men and women have access to different phenomenological knowledge, de knowledge, know-how, and personal knowledge of others in virtue of their gender. They also tend to represent the world in different terms, in virtue of their gendered interests, attitudes, emotions, and values, and perhaps also in virtue of different cognitive styles. These differences create different background beliefs against which additional information may be processed. Representational schemes that are functional for different gender roles and gendered attitudes make different kinds of information salient. In traditional domestic settings, women tend to notice dirt more than men, because their gendered role assigns them the task of cleaning up. Besides making different kinds of information salient to men and women, their different background knowledge may lead them to interpret commonly accessed information differently. A man might read a woman's demure smile as a coy "come on," where another woman may interpret it as her polite defensive reaction to unwanted attention from him. Such differences can spring from differential access to phenomenological knowledge. The male and female observers imaginatively project themselves into her situation, inferring her feelings from the feelings they think underlies her body language. Because men's and women's phenomenologies of embodiment are different, most men are not in the habit of smiling as a defense against unwanted attention from women. The man may narcissistically imagine the smile as relaxed and spontaneous, whereas the woman may suspect it as forced. Here are a few epistemological questions raised by these phenomena. Are there epistemic obstacles to men's ability to know when they are raping or sexually harassing women, or to legal institutions recognizing this, insofar as they confine their thinking within a masculine perspective? Do sexist or androcentric background beliefs of scientists cause them to generate sexist theories about women, despite their adherence to ostensibly objective scientific methods? How might the social practices of science be organized so that variations in background beliefs of inquirers function as a resource rather than an obstacle to scientific success? Relations to other inquirers. Gender differences in knowledge and background beliefs can be reduced if men and women participate in inquiry together. Each gender can take on testimony what the other can acquire through direct experience. Each may also learn how to exercise imaginative projection more effectively and to take up the perspective of the other gender. However, gender norms influence the terms on which men and women communicate. In many contexts, women are not allowed to speak or even show up, or their questions, comments, and challenges are ignored, interrupted, and systematically distorted, or they aren't accepted as experts. Gendered norms of conversational interaction and epistemic authority thus influence the ability of knowledge practices to incorporate the knowledge and experience of men and women into their processes of discovery and justification. Feminist epistemologists are therefore interested in exploring how gendered norms distort the dissemination of testimony and relations of cognitive authority among inquirers, and how the social relations of inquirers could be reformed, especially with regard to the allocation of epistemic authority, so as to enable more successful practices of inquiry. Now, everything that has been presented so far gives an explanation of what the feminist epistemologist believes to be the case, and the questions they are looking to answer on a more granular level. The situated knower is the core of feminist epistemology and serves as the starting point for individual theories that have sprung up from this baseline. Feminist epistemologists have developed their approaches to the situatedness of knowledge within three broad epistemological traditions: standpoint theory, postmodernism, and empiricism. Standpoint theory identifies a particular social perspective as epistemically privileged. Postmodernism rejects claims of epistemic privilege, emphasizes instead the contingency and instability of the social identity of knowers, and consequently of their representations. Empiricism seeks standards within a naturalized framework for differentiating the circumstances in which situatedness generates error and in which it constitutes a resource that can be harnessed to advance knowledge. It advances a conception of objectivity constituted by critical and cooperative relations amongst a plurality of differently situated inquirers. Now, in the next three videos, I will go through each of these three approaches, and what you will immediately find is how to properly categorize feminists according to what epistemological model they subscribe to. You will find that the militant Marxist feminists subscribe to standpoint theory. You will find that those claiming gender as a social construct come from the postmodernist group, namely the French contingent. Finally, you will also come to see how from empiricist feminism we can derive Newton's Principia as a rape manual. But what is most exciting is that what I believe we will ultimately find in feminist epistemology is the answer to how feminism will eventually destroy itself. I believe that by the end of this series, MGTOW will be, well, very positively disposed to intersectional feminism. When you combine intersectional feminism with what MGTOW have learned about female nature, I believe we have an answer to how feminism will play itself out in the immediate future and how inevitably it will collapse under its own weight. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for listening. Go team!